So we're going to talk about a series of revolutions that sweep across the world during the 20th and 21st century. And these are not in any particular order. I didn't line them up in any particular order. So if there's one you want to talk more about or less about, we can skip around a little. Yes?
I got made fun of yesterday in my world literature class. We were talking about revolutions, and I kept bringing up different historical revolutions, like very specific. And I'm the only non-English lit person.
What class was this?
World literature. We were talking about it. And I think we killed him. And he called me up. He said, "You're being very specific on dates."
Which teacher?
Because you're in that.
Julian.
Oh yeah, I'm in his class too, and he makes fun of me for being a history person too. As a matter of fact, I have a paper due in his class, and I was going to do a comparison between a couple of Netflix movies that have just come out, Hillbilly Elegy and The Devil All the Time, The Devil All the Time. And he was like, good, because those are new, which means you won't be able to give me a paper that's full of other people's research, which is what I did last time, because that's what historians do. And I said, don't worry, I'll find some sources on the geographical movement of populations across the hillbilly areas and pepper it with, you know, and he was like, no. So he feels that way about me too.
I do have a question.
Yes.
So whenever we're looking for things to like other people's opinions on things, should we do like Google Scholar or?
Google Scholar is a great site. What you're going to find a lot in Google Scholar are other peer-reviewed papers.
And pay for them.
No, Google Scholar doesn't. I mean, you can find sources for a lot of papers without it. Google Scholar is just like Google Images. It's just a pool of these kinds of things. What I like most about Google Scholar is that it shows you how many other people have cited this article. So it shows you can pull an article, and if it only has 2 other people that have ever cited it, it's probably not very well peer reviewed. So I like that part of Google Scholar, definitely. For my class, I'm pretty loose on the sources, but as you get into upper division classes, it has to be peer reviewed journal. It can't be an article from a website that's, you know, vaguely connected with BBC, you know, stuff like that. But in my class, it's like, I'm much broader. The number of people who did their westernization paper included sources like historyforkids.com.
I like how you're looking straight at me.
I didn't say it was you, but there were people who did, and I was like, that's a source that'll work for this class, but it won't work for all of them. Okay, so let's talk about this. Let's talk about some revolutions that take place. All right. So first, before we get into the revolutions and the way they open up, we have to talk for a second about Western exceptionalism. You all know what exceptionalism is, Western exceptionalism? We usually actually call it American exceptionalism, but it's the theory based on the idea that America's system is the best system you can have, and that therefore America has a responsibility to export their system to the rest of the world. Right, the democracy by elected representatives, by, you know, electoral colleges represent, you know, universal adult suffrage, all men and women having the right to vote, representatives being elected by, you know, private secret ballot, not, you know, being overlooked by other people, that this is the system America uses. And also that extends out to capitalism, free market entrepreneurship, innovation, all those kind of things, that America has the best system for that. So the whole rest of the world needs to move towards the system America is using. And in order to do that, they need to move away from other systems like communism or like fascism. They need to move away from those. So the idea of American exceptionalism was, we've cracked the code on how to run a country, and so we need to export that to other countries. What do y'all think about that?
Lie.
Well, the truth of the matter is that the system that America uses, the system that America is supposed to be using, is actually a very good system for making sure that representatives of every class are represented. If you took the American system of democracy and used it in India, then the untouchables would have representatives in the government. You know, the untouchables class.
But you get a lot of pushback.
Well, there's a reason, but people push back against that specifically because their class systems are part of their life, they're part of their culture. So when America tries to export its system, it often meets resistance. Now, the fact of the matter is, part of the reason it meets that resistance is because people who look at the American system go, I see what you're saying and how it's supposed to work, but it doesn't even work that way for y'all. Like, it doesn't even actually function that way for America. Say again?
Nothing.
Oh, okay. It's a flawed system because it's very difficult to maintain, because as soon as you begin electing officials, officials become purchasable. You know, as soon as you need to fundraise for a campaign, funds need to come from somewhere, and that those funds also come with strings attached. So the American system in its purest form might be one of the best systems, but that's not even how America uses it usually. So exporting it out is very difficult because they look at, you know, how it's being carried out in America, and they're like, we don't want that. We have a system that works for us and we like it better, even if it, you know, causes widespread famine among an entire class within like Stalin's Russia and stuff like that. But the idea is still very strong. And this extends out to Britain. Britain is also very exceptionalist. Other countries that have sort of embraced this representative democracy. America exported itself right after World War II in some very big ways. It deployed its military against against communist governments by supporting rebellions against those communist governments. It poured military forces actually into those areas. So it parked troops in Europe, in the Middle East, in Japan. It parked actual soldiers there to guard.
Venezuela, like.
Yeah, and in South America too, in Venezuela, in Guatemala, in all of these places, they actually physically parked troops, and that's all sort of part of the Truman Doctrine. And the Marshall Plan, they poured money, which we've talked about, I think, enough that y'all have a good idea of what happened there. They poured money into the economies that were accepting these governmental structures, and then made it so that they had the economy to compete with the ones that didn't. So that the thing that tends to drive populations towards communism is scarcity, famine, disrepresentation of the lowest classes. Those are the things that make communism appealing. So let's pour money in so that you won't be tempted to do that. Operation Condor actually parked CIA agents in various and sundry places. Operations like Operation Condor, where CIA agents actually detained and tortured and sometimes assassinated government officials in order to promote a certain government to rise. So in places where there was a tug of war between two types of government, and one of them was more communistic and the other one wasn't, even if it was fascistic. Fascistic? Yeah, that's a word. We're gonna go with that being a word.
Russia does the same thing, they just do it in the shadow, or they do it a lot more in the open.
Well, they definitely do now, but the KGB also did that. They supported the factions that supported them. So they poured troops, they poured secret agent help for the communists in other countries, and we poured secret agent help for the non-communists in those countries. Operation Condor was mostly South America, but actually, you know, CIA to overthrow governments. That's a, hey, y'all watch Black Panther?
Yeah.
Yeah, you know that he talks for just like a split second. He talks for a split second about what that other guy's job was when he was a CIA agent. And his job was to go in, infiltrate, and help the government fall apart.
Yeah, well.
Yeah, and he was good at that. And then he did it to Wakanda and Roman. So, and then, but he lost.
Wakanda did it bad.
He lost because, anyway. So that's kind of the basis of that. So part of the reason why things have changed in those fields, in those doctrines, in those Marshall Plan and in Operation Condor and CIA, stuff like that, is because we have had a global communications revolution. We have gone from letters crossing the ocean on boats to telegraphs, to telephones, to now instantaneous news. And this really started to hit its peak during like the Vietnam War. Even as far back, even as late as the Korean War, news was curated. News was gathered and then it was put together and then it was released to the public after people had combed through it and figured out, you know, exactly the best way to present this. So if you look at news footage from the Korean War versus news footage from the Vietnam War, you can tell there's a big difference. And part of the reason for that was because of the possibility of instantaneous communication.
And then you get issues like Jane Fonda.
Yeah, and that's exactly what happened, is that you got people who made the public aware of things that were going, not just the American public, the whole world, aware of things before anybody had a chance to put it in the context of optimistic exceptionalism. You know, you can take a story like the boys dying of cold in the Battle of the Bulge, and spin it in such a way where you're presenting the news, but at the same time, you're like, things are dark, but we're going to come out of this, and troops are already in action, starting to plan was it the 101st Air, the 101st is surrounded, but 7th Cav is going to come in and rescue him or something. I don't remember. I always get those backwards. My grandfather was one and my dad was the other. And so they had to be rescued. But anyway.
That was the third arm.
Was it? I don't remember. But my point is that the American public did not become aware of what was happening to the troops until somebody had a chance to couch it in propaganda to make it come out the way you wanted it to. And they were still reporting the news, but they were reporting it with, they plated it well in order to show you, yes, this is definitely liver pate, but it's plated well.
It's fun. Yeah.
That changed when it became possible for a reporter to report from the ground instantaneously to his home base, which happens during the late 60s. It became possible through satellite technology during the 70s for a reporter on the ground to send a message faster than it could read. And then it became possible for somebody to maintain a round-the-clock news network. Even then, news didn't come on until a certain time. So, you had the reporter on the ground saying, this is what's happening to our troops in Vietnam right now. I've just come back, and they sent 200 men out and only 40 of them came back. But then that would be couched by the time it came out in the 6 o'clock news, 7 o'clock news. Then we began to have 24-hour news networks. So I don't know if anybody here was alive before there were 24-hour news networks. I bet you weren't. I bet maybe Sam. But
Yep, I was.
yeah, that there was a time where you had to tune into the news, and if you missed it, then you had to catch up later. But the ability to check all day, every day for what's going on changes the way news is presented. Yeah, and then we added on top of that in the late 90s and early 2000s, we added on top of that the ability for people to report news themselves through social media. So now it doesn't have to be curated by a news organization in order for people to hear it from across the globe. All you have to have is a Facebook account and a cell phone.
I think someone put it this way, that we haven't increased school shootings in general. We just now have access to them.
It's an interesting thought, but I think that's probably inaccurate. Shootings in general, possibly the gun violence as a whole, but the idea of the shooter who walks into a place full of strangers and opens fire, that's still new. As a matter of fact, I was there for the first one. Not there, but it was in my town.
Really?
Yeah, Luby's. There was
Yeah.
the Luby's massacre was in Killeen, Texas.
Oh,
and it was
yeah.
in my town, and it was on early out day, and I was a senior in high school. So I was driving home from school when suddenly every cop in the vicinity was pulling in front of me to go down this one street. And I was like, weird. And I went home. And what had happened is that a man had driven his truck through a plate glass window, had gotten out of his truck and opened fire on Luby's. And nobody had done that before. That had never happened. That was not something that had happened. There was, like, in the 70s, there was a guy who opened fire on a football stadium from a clock tower. That's it. Other than that, the idea of, and he killed himself, which means we still don't know why he did it. There was nobody in that Luby's that was connected to him at all. And it was like, the whole nation was like, what the heck just happened? We were so baffled. And then it happened again, like 5 years later. And they were like, this happened just recently, 5 years ago.
It makes you believe in demons.
Later, and then it happened again.
Someone walked in the
Now
hallway.
it's happened. Now it's happening on a daily basis. So I think there has been an increase in that. And part of the reason for that probably has to do with this communications revolution, because social media is actually a place where everybody can find an affirming voice for what they believe, even if what they believe is homicidal. You can find people who support your desire to sow chaos, and you can connect with them, and that emboldens people. So that revolution is pretty substantial, I feel. And we're going to talk more about that as we talk about the Arab Spring. But we talked on and off about Africa throughout the semester, and you know that the European powers carved up Africa and took it over.
Oh, that's a Nelson Mandela.
Yeah, this is Nelson Mandela. So apartheid is a word that y'all should all know. If you don't, then you will. Now, apartheid actually means separation, and it is government sanctioned racial separation, government sanctioned discrimination. It's specifically apartheid when we talk about Africa, but there was a news story on BBC this morning about apartheid in Israel, where there is a government sanctioned discrimination against people who are Muslim Palestinians. So that's still being called apartheid. It's the practice of actually keeping people separate and keeping them from having the ability to hold land, the ability to hold office, all those kinds of rights. It was standard operating procedure in most European held African countries for decades. Go ahead.
And I felt like it was a little bit worse than segregation.
Yeah, no, it's if you take apartheid and you compare it to Jim Crow segregation, Jim Crow segregation required you to maintain separate but equal, and people made a little bit of an attempt to actually do that. And also enforcement of Jim Crow laws was vigilante largely. If you could spend a night in jail for violating, being someplace as a Black person that white people were supposed to be. But that was probably about as bad as it got unless you were vigilante justice, unless you were lynched. In Africa, a lot of the laws were more strict than that. So like Trevor Noah, any of y'all know Trevor Noah? Trevor Noah is a product of apartheid because his mother was Black and his father was white. And he was so obviously himself biracial. So he jokes in his stand-up comedy about the fact that he was like a bag of weed. He was like something neither of his parents could be caught with. So what would happen is if they were out for a walk and somebody was coming, they would actually separate and he would find himself walking alone for a few minutes until they were around the corner. And he calls himself, so I was like a bag of weed, nobody wanted to get caught with me, because his birth was a violation of the law. So apartheid started to peaceful protest movements to end apartheid. Gandhi sort of kicked these off in India. Nelson Mandela kicked them off. Peaceful, non-violent protests against apartheid, coupled with violent, terroristic actions against apartheid, eventually lead to what we call the Free Africa. And what you find if you study this in literature is that Africa it was robbed of its identity through the diaspora of slavery. And then it was robbed of its identity through the imposition of European governments. So what you find in places like Nigeria, in the Congo, places where the European government was specifically very strong, is that over the last 20 to 30 years, they've been inventing their own culture. So plays draw on old fables and then try to invent an arc that goes back that far. Try to invent a culture that actually, spans the years. But the truth is, in a lot of these countries, the culture that they have is only 20 years old, 30 years old. And they're doing their best to try to reinvent themselves. In a lot of these places, when the European powers are defeated and the local and race is no longer an issue, and people begin to take power that are actually native to these African countries, what you find often is gang warfare. And you find power-hungry individuals that come in and take power. So this free Africa movement, in a lot of places, leads to violence of its own. So you have warlords that take over an area and then do battle with each other and then take over an area. And as a result, assets don't make it to the population. So we have decades of people starving in Ethiopia, for example.
This is where we get the Hotel Rwanda.
And Hotel Rwanda is a great example of that. The Rwanda revolutions are an example of that. The warlords who are taking power, because there is now a vacuum, because the European powers have left, but the politicians who could take over, the educated ones, were also the nonviolent ones, so warlords end up taking over. Things in certain countries are getting better. For example, I don't know if you'll know this, but Ghana did really good with COVID.
Yeah.
So they survived, they implemented a system in Ghana that was actually a very strong way to get on top of COVID testing right from the get-go. That was a reflection of the fact that the government in Ghana, it has actually pulled itself up quite a lot and restructured itself. But in a lot of these places, they're still struggling to this day, especially in this area here. There is a lot of warlord embattlement, and that just has to do with the fact that resources are so scarce. So control of those resources, it matters a lot. Any questions about that?
You remember which one of Mandela's associates was the one that they assassinated and then buried in a drum? About. Remember which one that was?
No, but feel free to Google it and let us know.
I love that those are all basic questions.
Jordan managed to make it about a
court
corpse again.
on Sub-Sahara.
So where do we stand on the Mandela effect?
The Mandela effect?
Yeah,
Have you not heard of the Mandela effect?
where it's like, so what is it, like,
It's
people
pretty
remember
much-
it differently.
Yeah, so like Berenstain Bears, for instance, is actually spelled AIN. But almost everybody remembers it being Stein.
Okay,
But I think it's not related to Mandela, it's related to
Well,
the
there-
Indian Mandela.
So there was one where,
Mandela.
like, I remember, people remember him like dying in prison.
Yeah,
And then, like, not.
But there was a big movie, I think that's where they were getting that from, thinking that he died, because they looked the same.
yeah, I think this is, that's actually a product of this. That's actually a product of if your primary source for news is social media, you probably only read headlines.
I mean, I think.
And as a result, they don't make memory paths into your head. You don't actually internalize what's happening. So you end up with just sketches of things and then all the details kind of get lost.
It's like that thing in deja vu, that you remember like a little bit.
Right. Okay, so human rights in general. So we start with apartheid and then we can talk about human rights in general. In 1959, the European Union established the European Court of Human Rights, partly to prosecute crimes that had already happened and violations that were had already taken place, and partly to end human rights violations that were taking place at the time. For the most part, what they've been used since then for is prosecuting leaders who carry out acts of massive human rights violations. It's an international committee, so it's made up of all different countries. A country that is found guilty of committing human rights campaigns is often punished. So how do you punish a country?
Take away its resources.
Sanctions.
Sanctions, right? You make it so that they have to pay damages to, but also just you make it so that you cripple their trade. So we have human rights violations. The European Court of Human Rights has found Putin guilty at least once of human rights violations, and he doesn't care because so the sanctions that are placed against these human rights abuses. So what do we identify as human rights abuses then? Y'all remember a couple of years ago when what's his name was using gas on his own people?
Yeah.
Yeah, so that he was convicted of having committed human rights violations. Saddam Hussein was convicted of having committed human rights violations for dumping toxic chemicals on his own people, for massive genocide, things like that.
Hitler.
So, yeah,
Well, Hitler was dead, so,
that's what it is.
Yeah, he talked about.
but
I mean,
yeah,
they've done
but
that
a lot of his
for
men, a lot of his officers, I think the last one was in the 80s too, who was convicted of human rights abuses for
Oh, yeah, they're still on.
being an officer in the concentration camps. So the reason that I bring this up as a revolutionary thing is because for many generations, it hasn't been another country's job to tell you whether or not you're committing acts of atrocities against your own people. And that's reflected in the fact that Pol Pot was able to carry out massive genocide in amongst his own people. And governments actually weighed, well, do we get involved or don't we? Do we support the Khmer Rouge or don't we? I mean, he's killing all his own people, but you know, what part of you, you stupid man. A couple more generations of that and we won't take that from you anymore. I mean, how involved does a country get? So the idea of forming an international council specifically so that no one country makes it their job, what one country probably was trying to make it their job in the 50s? America, that's right. America, through its doctrines and its exceptionalism, was trying to enforce these things and then was the one imposing the sanctions and stuff. So by making it the European Union doing it, it actually takes the power out of a single government and also the responsibility out of a single government so the government doesn't have to decide whether or not they're going to do it. The European Union does it. It's not foolproof. We talked a little bit about this on Thursday. We talked about the Islamic Revolution. And it is a revolution. It is a change in the way Islam is presented to the world that actually takes place during the 20th century. Those Western ideology governments that were imposed, there was a strong kickback against them, especially in Islamic communities. President Carter tried to establish a democracy-friendly government in Iran. And when he tried to elevate the government that wanted Iran to be a democracy, other forces rose up in protest against that, and sometimes terroristic violence, and then replaced them with religious fundamentalists instead. So America swoops in. America says, this is the guy we want in office because he intends to embrace all the things that we like about America. He intends to embrace, elected representation and capitalism, all those kind of things. And they go, okay, so that's our number one target, to take that guy out. And then they do. And as a result, the person they put in power is now a religious fundamentalist. There's a possibility, and I don't mean to commit any kind of treason by saying this, there's a possibility if America had not stepped in, what they would have ended up with was a moderate fundamental religious person. Not fundamental, a moderate religious Islamic person. They would have ended up somebody that was a stepping stone between democracy and theocracy, somebody in between that. Instead, because they intervened and tried to put their person in place, what we end up with in Iran is a fundamentalist. And then that movement kind of spreads out over countries that are mainly Islamic to begin with. Extremists call for more and more violent actions to remove Western influence. Those are the fatwas that bin Laden put out, one of which ended in, and I'm going to go ahead and do this even though I know I'm going to regret it. One of them, for example, was the bombing of the towers on 9/11 on September 11th, 2001, which was in 2001, by the way.
Yes.
Our former president said it was in 2011 because he thought that 11 in 9/11 was 2011.
Wait, did
Gave
he
a whole
really
speech
say
about
that?
it. Yeah, he did.
Wait,
Jesus.
Biden?
He's
No,
from New
Trump.
York.
Yeah, huh?
He's from New York.
He was banned.
He was there, but
Yeah.
he was there, but this thing he's old. This thing happens to old people where they're like, was that really 10 whole years ago? Because it feels like it was just recently. Well, that was just recently. No, sweetie, that was 20 years ago. So, when he gave the speech, it could have just been a stumble, but the point being, it was in 2001.
Thanks for making me feel older.
How many of y'all were alive for 9/11? You have any memory of it?
I was 18.
They wheeled the TV into our class of.
What class were you in, Jordan?
I was in math, seventh grade math. No, I was. in
I'm sorry, I didn't mean what class. What grade were you in? What
I
grade?
was, I was 7 years old, so I was in second.
So you were 7 years old when that actually happened. Say again?
I was in fifth grade when it happened.
Okay, the day that it actually happened, did you hear about it or did you just hear about it like as the days went
No,
on?
no, I shut down.
I was,
We went and got gas,
Yeah.
because everybody was freaking out.
Yeah.
In Texas?
Yes,
Everybody was freaking out in Texas about a bombing that happened in New York.
yes. They were
That was
going to go
weird.
get gas, and then my brother was in the mental hospital, so we went and sat outside the hospital.
Okay, I'm gonna tell you, I was an adult, barely an adult in 2011. I guess I would have been
You mean 2001?
2001. Oh, I just
You
did it.
did it.
That was me that did that. In 2001, I would have been just turning 25. I had just turned 25. So I had two small children. One of them was in preschool and one of them was in diapers. Anyway, and we were living in Connecticut on the border of New York, 45 minutes from New York City.
Oh, geez.
So, and we were living in a town that made its living by being the place that people came home to after working all day in Manhattan, because it was a 40-minute train ride from Manhattan to where we lived. So in our town of 3,000 people, we lost 16 people in that event. But one of the weirdest things for me was when everybody said, this is Osama bin Laden that's doing this. And I was like, who? Because up until that point, I'd never heard of the man. I didn't have any idea who he was. So these acts of terroristic violence are sort of you come into our country, we'll come into your country kind of mentality. And that one of the biggest things that changed was that it changed the way that Western countries viewed Islamic people. Because up until the 70s and 80s when these radical fundamentalists began to rise in power. Up until that point, Islam was just another expression of religion, and the fact that these were not Christian countries wasn't the reason we went to war with them. Britain didn't go to war with the Egyptian Islamic forces because they were Islamic. Britain went to war with them because they had the Suez Canal, and Britain needed it. So the revolution that happens here is the idea that this represents Islam, not the largely peaceful people with a few radical people in charge.
And people need to learn about the difference between Islam, Sikh, and Hindu, because I get so many people.
Yeah, and people that Sikh in general are incredibly peaceful people.
And a
So,
lot of people, anything
Yeah.
in the Middle East is, you know, one whole thing.
yeah, it's all, yeah, and that's something that it goes both ways, because the belief is that all Western ideology is all one thing too. And that's how they propagandize it. Radical fundamentalist Islamic people point to the worst examples of American Westernism and say that's what all Americans are like. So they do it in reverse too. Yeah. So, all right, it's shifting subjects rather strongly now. Let's talk about climate revolution. Another revolution that takes place during the 20th century is that because of satellite technology and expanded global connectivity within the science community, we are suddenly becoming aware of the effect of industry on climate. There's more information, and therefore there's more material for climate activists to use. These are some pictures that I thought were kind of interesting. This is a picture of London in, I think it's the 1950s or 60s. Okay. This was life for, do y'all watch The Crown? Any of y'all watch The Crown? Yeah, do you remember the episode where they had the fog that wouldn't go away?
Yeah.
Yeah, that was smoke. It wasn't fog. Like the entire country was bathed in smoke for several days.
So they just always look nasty.
Was that the first or second season?
That was first season. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's always been that way. It's always been smoggy, but it's also always been the receiving area of a lot of the industry smokestacks.
And that it lasted for several days.
Right. So here is, this is, I think this is the Dead Sea. Is this the Dead Sea?
Yes.
Yeah, this is the Dead Sea. And these are pictures that are 5 years apart.
Wow.
Okay. So there's no doubt within the scientific community that the climate is changing. There was a time when the argument was the climate is changing. No, it's not. Now the argument is the climate is changing because of us. No, it's not changing because of us. The belief that there is actual change happening can be, you could demonstrate it by just pointing to how many Category 5 hurricanes there were last year versus how many there were the entire 20 years before that. So obviously things are shifting and things are changing. The question is how much of that is a result of human interaction and how much of it is just the natural process of the planet. We know as historians, we've studied this, that there have been periods of ice and warmth and changing temperatures that have reshaped all of society in the earth before. The question is, would it be happening at this speed if it weren't for the imposition of, the burning of fossil fuels and all of those kinds of things? Would it be happening as fast?
I mean, I've been told our ice cap's the warmest they've ever been
Mhm.
on record right now.
Yeah, this is the warmest in our ability to know history. Anyway, the warmest that we know. We can only go back so far. But as a result, when they melt, the water rises, the salinization changes, and that causes all kinds of storms. Those storms are an attempt on the part of the earth to rebalance. There's a water cycle. If you screw up with one part of the cycle, another part of the cycle is going to hit back. So the hope of a lot of people, especially industrialist people, is, well, the world will rebalance itself. Let's keep doing what we're doing. And then the extremist climate activists are saying we have to stop everything we're doing. But at this point, many scientists are saying we're past that point. We need to start moving away from the coasts because this is definitely going to happen. The flooding of the coast, the rising of the water level, you're going to have more and more superstorms that hit your coastal cities. People need to start moving towards the middle of the country because there's no way around it at this point. New York City is going to flood. my Florida cities are gonna flood.
New Orleans already flooded.
New Orleans floods almost every year now. That didn't
Houston.
used to happen. That's new. Houston floods almost every year now. So people need to start thinking about moving into the middle of the country, which is bad news for us here in Texarkana. Because that means we're gonna get people, if they listen to scientists, which I don't know that they will. Anybody else got thoughts on the climate revolution?
Yes, what is the young lady name that she's about 16 now? Is it Greta?
Greta
Greta Thunberg.
Is it
Okay.
Thunberg or-
Thunberg.
Okay.
It's Thunberg, Greta Thunberg. Yeah, and her whole thing is, she's an angry Norwegian person, but so she gets cast badly. But her whole thing is, we are. I'm not going to be the one who inherits this mess because they're talking about this, really starting to hit critical mass within 30 to 40 years. And by that point, I might not even know what my own name is, me personally. But y'all, a lot of y'all, that's the world that you and your children are going to inherit. And that's Greta's point, I guess, is we have a right to protest what you're doing to the environment that we're going to be stuck in, that you're not going to be stuck in. So she goes head to head with much older people specifically for that reason. She rowed herself, I guess, in a boat across the ocean in order to, in order to,
Your dad was with her.
was he?
I think that one of her parents was with her, because someone was taking pictures of her.
That wasn't her taking selfies?
I'll look it up.
Yeah, look it up. I might, like, this is a headline. I just saw this on Facebook, kind of mentality I've got about her, but so it's possible that I don't have all the details either, but she, as an act of climate protest, of climate activism, she traveled across water herself. So she scares the ever living daylights out of some people.
She's a scary child.
She's very intense.
Yeah.
And she's on, yes.
I know this is like way past and everything like that, but it took me a long time to find. I found the name of Nelson Mandela's friend that died.
Oh, okay.
It's Michael Harmel.
Okay. Nelson Mandela's friend that died and was put in a barrel.
Yeah.
That guy?
He didn't want to be seen as a martyr, so they tried to hide the evidence that he had died by boiling with an acid.
Uh-huh.
Horrifying.
And that didn't go well because you were able to find it. So
Yeah.
Much even. It's
Cool.
hard
It
to-
took me a really long time
Yeah,
to
because
find them.
everything that's coming up is Pico.
Okay.
Beat by the police.
Yeah.
And then left chained to a tree.
the 20th century kicked off movements for women's rights
It was
in,
her father and a British professional sailor
okay, so, yeah, but their boat wasn't,
and her little brother.
what kind of boat was it though?
It was just a sailing boat,
Right, it was a sailing boat, so she sailed, as opposed to,
fine.
burning engine to get there. Anyway, that was the idea. Okay, so the 20th century kicked off with massive women's rights movements in most Western countries. Women were suing for suffrage. They were protesting for their right to vote. And when the right to vote and own property, those are two of the biggest things that women fought for in the early part of the 20th century, because up until that point, women couldn't own property if they were married. So marriage actually meant your property got handed over to your husband. And the idea of a married woman being able to own her own property and being able to choose her own representative, independent of her husband, is at the foundation of everything else that, gives women the ability to do what they need to do, is being able to choose who represents you and being able to own something. So these are the things that that the women's rights movement started off with in the 20th century. As they achieved the right to vote in most Western countries, they began to step up and say, now that we have some representative in the government, now that we have some representation, let's address some of these other inequalities. So let's talk for a second about the wage gap. How many of y'all don't know that there's a gap between male and female job earnings? I mean, how many of y'all have heard that this is a thing? That sometimes all you need to do to make more money is just be born male? Okay, so there are a lot of people that would argue that that's not a real thing, that women actually choose to have a wage gap because they choose not to advance, they choose to go home to their families and miss out on opportunities to advance. What do y'all think? Do you think it's a real thing?
Yes, it is.
They literally
Okay.
say that Japan was it's a real thing for them.
Yeah. Yeah, and part of the reason for that is because they want to encourage Japanese women to have children
Yeah.
because they have a an elder, booming elder population and very low infant replacement rate. So they want to encourage women to have children so they don't pay them as much in the workplace, I guess. So do we have anybody, I know I'm a female teacher standing up here going, what do you think? Do you think that's not a real thing? And I'm actually genuinely curious. Is there anybody who thinks this is just coincidental and just number crunching? And that actually women are provided the same opportunities as everybody else?
I think the opportunity is there, but the ideas are not.
Okay,
Because like, when I had my first kid, fine, let's go back to work. Second kid came around, everyone was like, oh, you probably need to go home and you need to take care of those kids.
and they didn't say that to your husband?
No. And even my boss was just like, you're taking more time off, we should probably start looking at new things.
Well,
So
there has been a statistical shift in which parent is the caretaker of the children, though. There's been a lower rate of women doing it and a higher rate of men doing it. I didn't know any stay-at-home dads when I was a kid. Now I know like 20 stay-at-home dads whose job it is to stay home with the kids while mom goes out to
we
work.
have a culture thing too, because this family was really pushing me.
Well,
But
that's probably true.
I think the opportunities are there.
Mhm.
It's just the idea is that the women should still be going home to be with. And then you get told that, and it pushes.
Right, so women as a whole don't take advantage of the opportunities to advance the women do because they're focusing on the
And then if
family.
you do, you're considered a bitch.
The truth of the matter is
You
that
are.
there are, yeah, Haley, that was a statistic I was about to bring up. The other part of that is the way women manipulate their workplace, the way women manipulate their economic positions also has to do with a woman who is assertive is perceived as pushy or bitchy, whereas a man who is assertive is perceived as ambitious or driven. And these are products of a former generation, of several former generations, about the correct sugar and spice versus, yeah, nice. Women are supposed to be nice. And that's something you never say, I hope these men are nice. You hope these men are competent. You hope these men are capable. So in some countries, the way that this manifests itself has to do with assault. America has made strides and is doing its best, but countries like India, for example, the rate of assault versus prosecution of assault is really, really a big gap. The distance between the number of people that get accused of rape and the number of people that actually convicted.
They've been lynching quite a bit of rapists though.
Yeah, they really started to kick it up in the last 5 years, but part of the reason for that is because of massive protests that are happening in India, in which European countries are getting involved in. So in 2015, something like that, the Me Too movement that kicked off in America, the product of communications revolution right there. We're going to run out of time, aren't we? All right, so following right on the heels of the women's rights revolution, let's talk about the LGBT rights revolution. In America, Stonewall is where we start to count the movement of protest to gain rights for gay and lesbian people, and eventually what you end up with is the alphabet LGBTQI+, et cetera, et cetera. And it started because of arrests made at a club where drag queens were arrested, and usually they had arrests and raids all the time. They had arrests and raids all the time at this club. This particular time, the arrestees ran out into the street in the middle of, an evening in which lots of clubs were having parties and people were coming and going all over the place. The arrestees ran out into the street and began to scream for help. And there was a shift in which it started off with police marching in like they always did and arresting any guy that seemed like he was wearing women's clothes, and it ended up being the police hiding inside the building from an angry mob outside. So that was the Stonewall riot, and that was the kickoff of our pride parades and things like that. As science has made more advances in understanding the things that lead to gender dysphoria, the things that lead to homosexuality, the things that lead to those, what biologists have discovered is that more and more of it is not choices, but is actual birth, is actual,
biology.
It's actual biology that's much more complicated. But the reason why this is an issue is because of stuff that happened in the 50s. Because in the 50s, following World War II, there was a large movement within most westernized countries to very strictly define the roles of men and women in order to build back economies in which women had taken over the men's jobs so the men could go to war. And now we're supposed to go back home and establish a right way for somebody to be a woman and a wife, and a right way for somebody to be a husband or a man. And what that revealed is that the complexity that had existed before that was now getting ignored. So you can go back in history quite a long way and find examples of extremely effeminate men or extremely masculine women living in society, and they had words for that. Say again?
The Roaring Twenties, they had drag.
Yeah, it was actually not that. I mean, if you go back into Jewish society, there's 6 genders in Jewish society going all the way back 300 years. Is it 6?
Oh.
Might be 5.
So what they did to Tyrion is horrible.
So the rise of LGBT rights is not about an increase in the number of people who identify as gay, lesbian, trans, a different identity from what they were assigned at birth. It's 6, right?
6.
Yeah. You can go all the way back to founding documents of the Jew and find there are 6 names for different genders. So this is Native Americans had like 9. I don't know. This is something that's been along for a while. Yes.
I was wrong. I'm sorry. There was 2 of them. They said, are there 6 or more? But it's actually 8.
Okay. All right. My point is that the strict men, God created us male and female, and this is what is Adam and Eve, not Adam and Steve. That dialogue didn't start until after the 60s and 70s. Before that, it's not that it didn't exist, it's that it was so interwoven with society that nobody cared or that nobody paid attention to it. So what we have here is a revolution in the way that these rights are codified. Like the ability of two men to live together for their whole lives and become part of history as a couple that lived together for their whole lives, versus the ability of those 2 men to stand in front of a judge and have a certificate signed, which is new. That's the part that's new. So y'all can hit me back for that if you want to, because I know that there are probably people that don't believe in any of that, and that's fine. I'm a raging ally, so you're going to run into this with me no matter what. But because of the interactions that I've had to do a lot of research on this specifically for this reason. And there's so much biology intertwined in this that at this point, anyway, those rights for couples to marry, rights for people to live and work as the gender that they identify with versus the one they were assigned at birth, rippled across the country. Weirdly, not so much starting with America, starting more with Europe, but America kind of controls the news. So rippling across until now we have legalized marriage in several major countries. And you still have that can still be convicted and sentenced to beheading in other countries, or sentenced to concentration camps, or for example, as is in Croatia, for example, it doesn't exist in Croatia, says the Croatian government, and then they have concentration camps to make sure that remains true. So we still have this wide ranging.
I mean, Britain was still chemically castrating people up until the 80s.
Right. So this
By
is
the way,
in 2017. These are sexual orientation laws in the world. The closer to green they are, the more, the less conservative they are. In the places where it's red, those are places where you can still be beheaded, where you can still be executed, put to death for engaging in any kind of LGBT identification.
Mainly Muslim.
I guess, I'm not sure. The yellow countries, you can be imprisoned, so.
Yeah, but the Asian countries, those are mainly Muslim. What's going on with Australia?
And part of the reason for that, Australia is like,
We don't know yet.
It's okay.
it's legalized everywhere, but yeah,
Just don't talk about
yeah. Okay, so we're gonna finish up by talking about the conflicts in Latin America that have led to the refugee crisis that we have now in America.
Are we getting a bit of sauce? And you being told to eat the pepper rabbits because they have no food?
That this is, and I can only cover it in like 2 minutes. So basically what I'm going to say is that that several of these countries that started off by having revolutions for independence in the late 1800s, which then led to power struggles between opposing juntas during the early 1900s, have massive economic crises during the late 1900s. And those massive economic crises lead to gang warfare in the streets. So homelessness and people flee from the rural areas into the urban areas. And in those urban areas, there's widespread homelessness, which is feeding ground for what? We talked about it last week. What do you find a lot of in any place that you have massive urban homelessness?
Cannibalism.
Thinking as a kid.
Recruitment among the youth. Yes, recruitment among the youth. I don't know about cannibalism.
I thought it was a fellow.
Jordan didn't say cannibalism. That was Othello this time. But it becomes a breeding ground for recruitment for gang activity among the youth. And what that leads to is increased violence, because I don't know how to tell y'all this because most of y'all are pretty young, but if you're recruited into a gang young, you might not have the seasoned ability to pick your battles. And so violence just becomes more violence, which becomes more violence. So there aren't cool heads at the tops of these gangs. There's just, widespread young, you only live once mentality. So what that leads to is people like facing the very real probability that if they stay in they can't go back to the rural areas. If they stay in the urban areas, then their children, especially their young girls, will be recruited into a life that they don't want for them. That their young boys will be recruited into a life that will lead them to violence, and their young girls will be recruited into prostitution. And this is a very real thing that a lot of families in these countries had to face, which is what led to the crisis in 2008, in which people were actually paying massive sums of money to people to carry their children across the border into America. A lot of people looked at that crisis and thought, well, what's going on here is that they want their children to be citizens so they can become citizens. But actually what was happening is they just wanted their children out of the cities where they could not be recruited, right? Where they could not be pressed into service. Is not even recruited when you're talking about 11-year-old girls. Okay, massive, widespread.
And what they don't say is a lot of these people paying these coyotes in churches, trying to get the people out.
Yeah, and they're being taken in because, what they're promised is safe transport for their children across the border. What they actually receive is trucks full and boats full of unhealthy individuals being dumped. And then you end up with what we saw in the news a couple of weeks ago, where somebody literally dropped children over the wall because they've been paid to get the children across the wall. So that's what they did.
That's all that matters.
And as a result of that, you end up with refugee crisis at the border. American law states that if you feel that you are in danger in your own country, you can ask for sanctuary in America, and crossing the border and asking for sanctuary is not a crime. That's the way it's codified in the American legal system, is that when you go and petition for sanctuary, you can be on the other side of the border when you do that. You can flee into America and ask for sanctuary. But what happened in the last 10 years is that there was such a wave of that happening that sanctuary requests couldn't be processed fast enough. And by the time, and in some cases, the person petitioning for sanctuary is 3 years old. And they're literally putting 4-year-olds on the stand and trying to get them to testify to ask for their own sanctuary.
There's a video of a judge crying whenever you saw that.
Yeah, well, that's my point, is that the way the legal system works, that 4-year-old who didn't come across with her parents has to testify on her own behalf and ask for sanctuary. Now, I have 3 and 4-year-olds in my life. I can't imagine them coherently talking to a judge from the stand, can you?
In English and the language they don't know.
Right, so obviously to me, the answer to this is figure out what's going on in South America and try to figure out how to fix it so that people don't feel the need to flee. But in the meantime, that is what has led to this revolution crisis. We are out of time.